Hey everybody, it's your old pal John. I hope you're doing well. I got a note saying, have I heard of the Battle of Bamber Bridge? So I downloaded a video, and the only battle fought between American soldiers in World War II. Okay, so let's find out what this is about. I'd never heard of it.
We've done videos on friendly fire in World War II, Imperial Japan's inter-service hostilities, and Allied forces such as the Americans and Soviets going toe-to-toe.
Right.
But did you know that 2 American units fought and shot each other over in northwest England in June 1943? This is the story of the so-called Battle of Bamber Bridge, a skirmish fueled by beer and no small amount of racism.
Oh my gosh. All right. This is something that I guess Americans would look at this and they say if you didn't know about this and they would learn it. Unfortunately, people would not be all that shocked. I mean, the fact that it wasn't taught. It's not something if it's not something we're proud of, we don't teach it. Except for even like slavery or whatever. I mean, we do teach that, but I've never heard of this before, so I'm interested now. It's a good channel, by the way.
President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in July 1948. The branches of the United States Armed Forces suffered from varying degrees of racial segregation.
Yes.
The first clause of the order read as follows: "It is hereby declared that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Of course, the order didn't erase racism in the military, and it was put into effect some 5 years after the Battle of Bamber Bridge. Throughout World War II, some 2 million American servicemen passed through or were stationed in the UK for a variety of purposes, and they weren't always on the job. They often toured the UK and interacted with its denizens. Many American servicemen married English women and brought them back to America when the war was over.
You know, it's that did happen. Also happened in France and Germany. Matter of fact, my first job at a jewelry store, there was a French woman who came back. They were called war brides, and she came back to the U.S. and then, of course, they got a divorce.
More often than not, African Americans were well received by the British populace, at least at the start. When more racist white Americans poured into the UK, they imposed their aholery upon the British, refusing, for example, to eat at a restaurant that served black people. According to Roy Otterly's article, Dixie Invades Britain, which was published in 1942, American observers who were in the UK in 1942 when the first contingents arrived from America saw amicable and smooth relations develop between the Negro troops and their British hosts. So much so that certain white American soldiers became openly resentful, and they lost no time in attempting to discipline the British people.
Oh.
According to an article by historian Joseph Dickinson, the resentment was due, at least in part, to the frustration of white American soldiers who saw how open British women were to relationships with black Americans and simply couldn't handle it without chucking a massive tantrum. In the words of author Graham Smith, many young girls found the blacks fascinating, appreciating their attentiveness and good manners. The United States Army Air Forces, or USAF, the precursor to the US Air Force, operated out of more than 200 airfields in the UK.
So just a note, there's a lot to unpack here. I'm not going to do it, but if you were black and it was during World War II, you had just come through the Depression. Now, if you're talking about tiers of society, first of all, if you're black and from the South, that's one thing. But also note that during World War II in the United States, since it's such a large country, jobs opened up. And there was a migration from the South to the North, like places like Chicago and Philadelphia, where they're now manufacturing, war factories that are opening up and parts and things like that are being made and jobs are being had. The resentments tend to grow if you're white and you lose a job to somebody that's not white. And it's not just black, it's anybody else. Americans have a very colorful history of hating anyone that's not European. So, it's sort of, there were times in our history where it just boils over. And then everyone seems to be cool. Then it boils over. The 50s, 60s. There was no real good time in American history except for, you could probably say the most just time was at the end of the Civil War. But then Lincoln was shot, and we didn't make that leap that we kind of hoped to make. I think a lot of us hoped would make. But
each base housing an average of 2,500 men.
Oh, yeah. So point being is they had to be on their best behavior if they were in the Army or in the Air Force. I mean, you didn't talk back to people. You got put in your place. So, I mean, you had to have good manners.
Among the American units which flew out of the UK was the 8th Army Air Force, and one of the 8 supporting units was the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, a racially segregated unit composed of African American soldiers. These men were housed at Air Force Station 569, or more colloquially, Adam Hall, in the village of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, England.
So interesting.
Their job was to deliver, via trucks, war material to other air bases in the area.
So early on in the war, black soldiers were generally more regulated to supply status, driving trucks. There was one called the Red Ball Express that notoriously, after the Normandy landings, they would drive stuff to the front lines. It was just constantly going one way and back. And a lot of them were black drivers. But it wasn't until, earlier in the war for the Americans, like early to midway, I guess, that black combat soldiers actually had their thing. But they were more logistics.
When they were off duty, some of the men enjoyed a pint or two at a watering hole called Ye Old Hob Inn, where they were
cool.
more than amicable with the local English. When the white Americans started cracking down on this, demanding the establishment of a colour bar in the village's 3 pubs put up signs reading "Black Troops Only." Racism, it seems, would not be tolerated in Bamber Bridge. Unfortunately, the 234th US Military Police Company, which operated on the north side of the village, were especially sore about the attentive, well-mannered African American men winning the hearts of Bamber Bridge's women. The MPs had standing orders to arrest American soldiers who were out without a pass, who weren't dressed properly, or who were acting disorderly. On the 24th of June 1943, just days after the race riot back in Detroit, Michigan, they tried to use their power to give the black soldiers of the 1511th a hard time. The consequences were disastrous. While the specifics might vary between sources, the core of the story remains the same. Possibly because an African American soldier tried to purchase a beer after last orders had been called, MPs Roy A. Windsor and Ralph F. Ridgway entered Ye Old Hob Inn on the night of the 24th and tried to cite one Private Eugene Nunn for being without a pass and for wearing the wrong uniform.
What?
An argument broke out, and the locals, as well as British servicewomen of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, sided with Nunn and the 1511th. An unnamed white British soldier also chimed in, saying, "Why do you want to arrest them? They're not doing anything or bothering anybody." The heat increased, and one private, Lynn M. Adams of the 1511th, brandished a bottle. In retaliation, Windsor drew his gun. It might have gone down then and there had not a black sergeant by the name of William Byrd managed to defuse the situation.
Whoa.
The MPs got into their jeep and were on their way out, but Private Adams was mad and probably a little drunk and decided it would be a good idea to throw his bottle at the jeep. The MPs were outnumbered and chose not to retaliate at that moment. Instead, they gathered some reinforcements and ambushed the men of the 1511th as they were walking back to Adam Hall later that night. A fight ensued on the road, possibly with the MPs wielding billy clubs. The 1511th fought back with bottles and loose cobblestones.
Oh my gosh.
Supposedly to stop Private Adams from hurling a stone at him, MP Carson W. Bosman drew his gun and fired. The bullet struck the private in the neck, but he wasn't killed. The fight soon subsided, and the men of the 1511th made it back to Adam Hall mostly in one piece. At some point during the chaos, a rumor spread throughout the village. A black soldier had been shot in the back, and the MPs were out on a manhunt.
So this is some... what this kind of reminds me of is like the stuff from the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s in the South and before. I mean, if you're living in, I'll just like the hotbed of it, like Birmingham, Alabama, and you're black and you throw a bottle at police. I mean, there were things like there were lynchings. That's the way it was, and people in the North really were kind of sort of not dumb to it, but it wasn't obvious. But yeah, so that's not good, because this is the 1940s. Even in the North, I mean, to a certain extent, there was just almost as much racism.
There seems to be a little confusion about what happened next, but the resounding narrative is that a pissed-off crowd of some 200 black men rallied at Adam Hall, standing against their white senior officers and calling for war. It's possible they would have stormed the village en masse, but the 1511th's only black officer, Lieutenant Edwin D. Jones, was able to calm them down, for the time being. It wasn't long after that, however, that about a dozen MPs drove into Adam Hall in several jeeps and an improvised armoured car fitted with a machine gun. This prompted the 1511th to seize about 2/3 of the firearms stored at Adams Hall and either take up defensive positions or drive or run out into the night to meet the MPs head on. The locals were instructed to stay inside, and over the next 3 to 4 hours, a firefight raged throughout the Bamber Bridge area.
What?
A private of the 1511th, one William Crossland, took a bullet and died, while 4 or 5 other soldiers and 2 MPs were injured. It could have been much, much worse.
I'd say so.
All things considered. Following this mess, 2 trials were conducted. In the first, 4 of the African American men involved in the fight in which Private Adams was shot were found guilty of various offences, dishonourably discharged, and sentenced to hard labour. In the second trial, 28 of the 35 defenders were convicted of offences such as ignoring orders, failing to disperse, rioting, mutiny, seizing arms, and firing on officers and MPs. They were sentenced to as many as 15 years, but further reviews saw a reduction in these sentences and the release of some of the men. 15 of them returned to duty in June 1944, just in time for the Normandy landings.
Okay.
All in all, the longest period served by any of the men was just 13 months.
Yeah, actually that makes sense, because, you know, at this point, trained troops on the verge of the Normandy landings are they're a valuable asset. If you just want to break it down to numbers, black and white, you know. Nope, that sounded bad. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, trained troops on the verge. Yeah, you need everybody, especially logistics. Logistics is huge. It's like, I'm not sure. In World War II, for the Russians, it was like one logistics person for one combat person. I think I don't know what the British ratio was, but the American was something like 3 or 4 logistics to one combat soldier. So important, really important.
Again, things could have been much worse.
Yeah, they could have.
The commander of the 8th Army Air Force, General Ira C. Eaker, believed much of the blame fell on the MPs, whose blatant racism inspired the entire affair. The white officers of the 1511th were also largely to blame, as they did a terrible job of trying to pacify the rioting men at Adam Hall and also refused to tend to the wounded among them. At least one of them was reportedly drunk. Following the incident, the 1511th's and other trucking units' ranks were purged of racist officers, and black officers were integrated into the MP units.
Now, I actually heard about the purge that went on. I did not know, and maybe I did know, maybe I heard of years ago, Battle of Bamber Bridge, or the incident or something like that, but I didn't know the ins and outs of it.
Things got slightly better after that. We're interested to know what you think though. Had you heard of the Battle of Bamber Bridge before today? Why do you think it happened? Lastly, can you think of any similar battles which took place during the war? And shout out to my boy Kamal for suggesting this ages ago. Anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.
You know what? I actually hope that you guys learned something new. I certainly did, and thank you for the comment, or if you just want to say, thumbs up or no problem, or that was me. I definitely learned something new. There's a lot of interesting things that are out there that have an impact, but they're not readily talked about. Some people don't know about, like, here in the States we had a president called Herbert Hoover, and he was president when the Great Depression happened. But people remember him for presiding over the worst time in American history, and they basically, they ignorant blame him for the Great Depression, for making it whatever it was. And the fact of the matter is you do one thing wrong and everybody remembers it, but you all the right stuff that you do, doesn't get talked about. Well, so Herbert Hoover, for example, was, and I did a video like years ago on it. Herbert Hoover helped to feed Belgium with the Belgian Relief, I think it was, during World War I. And there are streets in Belgium called like Hoover Street or whatever it is, and there. But nobody talks about that. So you tell somebody about that here in the United States, about millions of dollars of money that he raised, and the ships and the logistics to feed Belgium, and all that stuff. Well, they only care about what happened to him when he was president of the United States and how terrible it was. And it wasn't his fault, Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Do you know any other stories? Do you have any suggestions on videos? Let me know. I'll talk to you. Bye-bye.